Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Rudge. I'm Associate Professor at Staffordshire University. And I'm going to talk a bit about a project that I've been working on for a number of years now, and how that feeds into work that was done in the past and work that I'm doing now and in the future. And the title perhaps is a little unusual, not another creative quarter. So it's not a criticism of creative quarters or creative clusters, but it's about trying to make creative economies inclusive and ubiquitous. It's looking at how we can work to make those creative economies more equal and more accessible to people, not just in the UK, but around the world. And although that's not a direct quote, creative economies occur in creative cities has become really a statement of fact, almost, in that artists, creative people, cultural practice is centered in cities, in major urban areas. And one of the aspects of the work that I've been doing is trying to look at how creative economies can work and be successful outside of those cities, in areas that are perhaps towns, rural areas, semi-rural areas, and more recently, internationally, in small island states, such as the ones that you find perhaps in the Pacific Islands or the Caribbean, in islands that have perhaps small communities, but still have wonderful creative practice. And it's how we can build economies around those small communities and make them successful and sustainable. So what I wanted to do is to take you back a little bit to a film that I was involved in way back in 2008. And I was working with a good friend of mine, a film producer friend of mine, and she was attached to a film called Soul Boy. And they wanted to shoot in an area where they could get access to great locations and talent in terms of crew, but also they were really keen to look at how they could work with a university. So I said, well, why don't you come to Stoke and shoot the film? So we built a partnership between the production and the university to shoot this film. And it was quite a groundbreaking project at that stage, because although a number of films had worked with universities to have work experience on their sets, to have students working on the films, what we did with this project was to look at how we could engage not just the university and the students in terms of work experience, but how it could become a true partner, how we could build a partnership between the production, the university, the city council, and the whole city. So we came together, we ironed out a number of issues that we had, but what we did do was create a hugely successful partnership that had around 25 students working on the production. And the film became really successful. It did really well as what was a small budget film at that stage. And it had a really big impact on the city. And I always like to show this photograph. You might recognize Martin Compston there on the left, who obviously is doing amazing things on TV, and Alfie Allen on the right, who became a big star in Game of Thrones. So I kind of like to make a point of saying that, yeah, I kind of broke their careers. It's obviously not true, but it's quite a nice shot of them sitting outside the performance centre at the university. And we used that as a place to do our rehearsals. So it was a really interesting project of seeing how a university and a city that didn't really have any background of film production, that had very little in the way of the infrastructure that you would find perhaps in Manchester or London, could work with a production and make that production successful. So off the back of that, I spent some time talking to the city councillors how we could build upon this, how we could look at how the PR that came out of the production, the great relationships that we built with the production companies involved, and how we could build a more, I suppose, visible film community in Stoke and get productions into the region, how we could encourage more productions to come into the region. So I got asked by an organisation called the North Staffordshire Regeneration Partnership to do some research to look at how we could build a film office in the city and how we could look at creating a community of practice both within the university and the students and the graduates, but also connecting that to the whole of the rest of the city, so that we could not just create more productions in the city, but also get those graduates onto those productions and to make the whole city a base for film and television and digital creative production. Off the back of that research report, we then created the film office that is still active now in the city. We started a festival. We started being much more active in working with organisations such as Creative England, and we brought a number of productions over the years into the city. Now, one of the interesting things that came out of that was just how talented the graduates coming out of our film and media courses were, and how much impact they were having as they started up their companies in the region. Because having the film office in the city, having a bit more visibility in the city, encouraged more students to stay. It encouraged those students to start up their businesses, their production companies, and to stay within the region. And it started to build quite a critical mass of great young graduate companies. And through a number of conversations that I had with people, both at the university and with local government and national organisations, we looked at the idea of creating a cluster, a film and media cluster, as the idea was then. So again, in 2016, I worked with the Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire Local Enterprise Partnership to do some further research, to look at how we could create a cluster and what that might look like and what it might do. And we found in doing that research that while we had quite a pocket in North Staffordshire around Stoke-on-Trent, there was actually a lot of activity happening across the whole county. And a number of these production companies were graduate companies, were our graduates from the film and TV courses, staying not just in Stoke, but staying in Stafford and Cannock and Lichfield and creating strong, successful companies. So in 2017, we then launched Platform, which is the moving image cluster for Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire. And the point of that was to try and support those companies that had started up in the region and to try and create a really strong moving image community in a city and a region that had no background in it. We weren't a major production centre like Bristol was or Manchester was. But what we did have was a university with fantastic film and media courses and talented graduates. And the idea of the cluster was to help them stay in the region, but then support them to grow, to help them get access to finance, to through that, to build the presence of Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire as a centre for moving image production. And that started to grow and that started to develop, and we brought a number of productions then into the city that worked really well. And we showcased the sector. We had a fantastic event down at the Houses of Parliament that was supported by our local MPs. And we took a number of our companies down to London to meet the sector from the capital, so that we could look at how we could fit our companies into the supply chain of the London companies. And that was a great event, and again got a lot of fantastic feedback from those companies and generated a lot of activity and a lot of business. We also had Creative England come to Stoke and do what was called their Be More series of events. They did a Be More Manchester, they did Be More Leeds, they came to Stoke to do Be More Stoke-on-Trent. And this event was about bringing producers and artists and creative people that work within the moving image sector together to create new productions, to develop new collaborations. And they came to Stoke-on-Trent, which I thought was a really great indication that a national organisation, after being in Manchester and Leeds, decided to come to Stoke, which was fantastic. And through that, platform got nominated and got named as part of what they call the Creative, the CE50, Creative England 50, which is each year they nominate 50 companies or individuals that are leaders and innovators within the sectors. And that was a fantastic thing to see for a new cluster that had started up in a city that, let's face it, had not had the best of press, that had had a number of issues around it in terms of its social, its economic performance. But in getting something like that, it showed that what we did have was a fantastic community of practitioners, that if we could support them, we could do some wonderful things. And we took this great bunch of people, with everybody there from our production companies to the Chamber of Commerce to our MPs, and really had, I think, a very valuable time meeting leaders of the sector. And we even ended up, this is a photograph of an event in the United Nations in Geneva back in, this is end of 2019. And I got asked to go and speak about platform and about the creative communities that we'd built in Stoke-on-Trent at a meeting of the Creative Economy Programme at the United Nations. And that was, again, a great opportunity to talk about what Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire was doing, what the university was doing in supporting these graduates, and how we can do something really impactful outside of a major urban centre. That we can do it in a small city. We can do it in a city that is perhaps not recognised for these industries. And off the back of that, I was working, looking at how we could extend this to other communities. How could we build perhaps communities in other regions that are not necessarily well known for either creative production or creative economies, or having the ability to make an economic impact? And I've been working on a research project around small island states. I'd been involved with doing work in the Caribbean since 2014 with young filmmakers over there. And this is a book that came out recently, which is about that very thing, which is about how we can build creative industries and creative economies in small island states, in very much the way that we looked at building platform in Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire, in an area that perhaps didn't have that kind of level of digital creative production, that we can take some of those lessons and apply them to islands in the Pacific or the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean, who want to take their economies, build them more towards a knowledge-based economy, as opposed to something perhaps purely like fisheries or tourism. And again, to give their graduates, their young people, the ability to innovate and be entrepreneurial, and then stay in the region and build a creative economy there. And
Sorry, that's 5 minutes.
That's fine. Okay, thank you. So I spent some time in the Caribbean as part of this research, and as part of the promotion of this research, working with entrepreneurs. This is a couple of filmmakers in St. Lucia that I did some work with, and spent some time talking to the government over there as well about how they could get involved with supporting these entrepreneurs, because it's really important that governments and organizations and investors can look at the value of creating these economies outside of the big cities, that we don't just have to put money into creating another cluster in London or another creative quarter in Berlin when they are already well served with those kind of facilities. What we need to do is look outside of those regions. We need to look at developing regions or areas, small cities or towns that could really benefit from having the support and investment into their creative economies. And being in the Caribbean was hugely beneficial and wonderful to see the reaction that came out of what I was trying to do. And did some great work and met some wonderful young people in these islands in the Eastern Caribbean who were incredibly enthusiastic about getting involved with these industries and wanting to do something in their own communities. And I think this is kind of really the point of what I was trying to say in this presentation, is that what we need to do is not think just about creative economies in big cities. We need to look at the benefits of creating those economies across very, very different types of geographies. Nobody would have thought, if you look at the majority of the literature on creative economies, that an island that has a population of 100,000 people could build something that is sustainable, that is economically impactful, and can give young people a reason to stay in the region. But that's what's starting to happen. We're starting to see it now in the Eastern Caribbean, in places like St. Lucia and Barbados. We're also starting to see it in the Indian Ocean. Mauritius has just launched their very first media city. Media City Mauritius is going to be built over the next 2 years to support creatives and digital creative companies working in that island. So I think really, I suppose, in summing up, it's about looking at what we can do to support those communities, to think about activity and practice, not just being centered in big cities in the Western world, in the global north, but looking at how we can make that truly ubiquitous, truly inclusive, and not just relegate some of these communities to, well, you haven't got the infrastructure, you haven't got the capacity to develop these kind of economies, because they have, but it needs support and it needs investment and it needs the belief that they can do that. So I think as a wrap up, I would probably encourage everybody, if they can, to look at how they can engage with some of these smaller communities, how they can look at talking to young people, graduate startups, companies that want to do something in their region, and see how perhaps we can support what they're doing, and make a creative economy available to lots of people in different geographies, in different places, other than our major cities. And I think I'm just about on time, Agatha, if that's right. And I'd like to wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, you are exactly. You have 30 seconds, perfectly planted. I think it's so fascinating to listen to that, and especially in the context of the project we're currently developing together. So, and also, yeah. I think I don't know how many of you been to the panel when I started saying that. It's just such an amazing thing for me to run this panel, because I work with all the people in this panel every day, but we never really had a chance to have a panel like this when I just hear about. Of course, it's just really lovely to have this kind of more in-depth conversation. So thank you so much, Peter. Really, really lovely and inspiring.
You're welcome.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
So now we have a really packed and another fascinating panel. So we have Fiona, Paul, John, and Andrew. So I'm just gonna mute myself and
we should be all in the room. This is going to be interesting because there's 4 of us that are going to be here talking all at the same time. So, well, not be all at the same time. I'm starting and we'll move through with the actual project itself. But hopefully everybody's in the room. Can I just check everyone's here with me? I can see Paul there. Is John Casella there?
Yes, he's here.
Is he here? Has he got his audio?
If you go to people, you will see everyone in the room today. So John is definitely here.
And Andy's definitely here with us too. So their audio should be available too.
Yes.
Hopefully you too. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to get started, Agatha, anyway.
So whenever you're ready, absolutely.
And we will go for it for you. So there's a number of different elements with regards to this actual project that we're going to go through today, and it's a project that's been very close to my heart as a history graduate as well. So I was really passionate about this project when it actually came to the table. My name is Fiona Graham. I'm an associate professor in film technology, and my background is very much in documentary production and content creation for a variety of different television channels over the years too. But lately we've been moving into a number of areas with regards to heritage. And as a result of that, this is what this project's all about. And it's been working with a number of different communities, both here in the UK and also working with communities in France as well. And the main subject is really to preserve, to educate and inform with all of the work that we actually do. And we're looking at this within this actual talk today, how film and communities can capture those secrets of an amazing crater called Hawthorne Crater, which marks the start of the Battle of the Somme on July the 1st, 1916. And as part of that, we are working with a number of different partners here from Staffordshire University, including my colleague Paul Ottey, but also military historian Andy Robertshaw, who has worked on a number of different films, including 1917 and They Shall Not Grow Old and War Horse as well as working with Professor John Casella too. The actual project itself has been on the go, and we've been working on it for about 2 years now. And thanks to the support of Erasmus, that's helped us to actually work in France and to actually move forward with that. Can we change the slide, please? I think the best way to actually tell this story, I think we all know about the first day of the Battle of the Somme itself is one of the most iconic times in the battle of the First World War. The location that we're actually at is part of a unique individual site that's actually based there on the Somme. And it was photographed by Geoffrey Malins, who was one of the first war cinematographers. And probably the best way to actually look at this is actually to go into the crater itself now with us, and hopefully the video will work with us as we go and see what Andy Robertshaw tells us from the crater itself and the project that we're actually all working on together.
This project's unique in many ways. It's unique looking at a crater. People have preserved craters before, but they haven't investigated them. It's also unique because most craters are blown and they're overrun, and that's the end of it. Here, the crater is blown. The Germans are not defeated. They use the crater, and we blow it again, and not quite the same place. So what we've got is the only crater on the Somme blown twice, and a crater which, once it's captured in November, goes out of use for virtually the rest of the war. So again, it's a time capsule of that spot in the war. This site's very unique in many ways, because although there has been a little bit of investigation, people walking around and sadly even recently doing metal detecting, there's been no survey of it. We don't even know actually how big it is, how deep it is, how it's changed over time. So the idea would be to look at it in terms of the chemical composition of the material in there. Has that been affected by the war? Has it actually affected the ecoclimate? We're thinking about the birds and the wildlife in there, but also thinking in terms of allowing the public to come here and look at that crater or craters and say, ah, now I understand what I'm looking at. Because for most people, it's a hole in the ground full of trees. Doesn't say much. We want them to understand what it really is, and actually perhaps change the pattern of tourism on the Somme, because this site's visited very, very briefly. Most people go look at the sunken lane, but here they'll be able to go, ah, sunken lane, that links to the mine at 720, and then the attack across those fields there, which actually means they'll be able to build up a picture about what the Germans were doing from this spot, how they dealt with the attack, and then later on, at the end of the Battle of the Somme, how the Highlanders were able to capture the Highland Division, this entire ridge, and move that way. Virtually every documentary about the First World War, and certainly anything about the Somme, shows the famous film shot by Geoffrey Malins from just down there, actually by that little building, which is a pump house used for irrigation. That's exactly where he was. So if someone comes here, they can go down there, look up at this area, perhaps nowadays with mobile phones, put the film on and go, that's where it happened. But what they won't realize is there are 2 mine explosions. We don't have any film of the second mine explosion because it happened in the dark and the fog. We don't have that one. But what people don't realize is that film of the mine explosion is the only film shot in the First World War showing a mine going off, which wasn't purely done for a demonstration purposes. It's unique film. And the coverage here, both on the 1st of July, with Geoffrey Malins, the cameraman, and Ernest Brooks, the stills man, and then later on Ernest Brooks coming back, means this is probably the most filmed and photographed spot of the First World War in a single day. This project...
And I think that's what's most exciting about it as well, from a film perspective for us, and from a perspective of factual film as well, that it is such an iconic site, and it's a unique site. We've never had access to this site on the Somme before in history, and to be able to work with the communities there in France that have allowed us to be there is really incredible, to actually work with absolute range of people. Now I'm going to move to John Casella, should be here to be able to talk through this slide. Are you there, John? I don't think we can hear John. It's okay, I'll take over from this if he's not actually around. As you can see from the actual communication, we're actually all working together across a range of different disciplines here. I'm from the background of television and film, and have been brought in here to actually capture and archive a lot of the site and work with the different communities that are actually there to actually create new narratives and tell the story and bring those stories alive, and to actually bring them into museums and content creation both in France, but also to bring them home too and into education. So it's working with myself and with my colleague, cinematographer Paul Otti, but also working with the leads there, the military historians who are actually there, with Andy Robertshaw and his knowledge of the actual site itself. And more than anything, as you can see from the circle lab that we've actually created, it's the communities that drive this. Without the communities and working with the communities there, we couldn't have access to the site, and we couldn't actually create the stories and get the new knowledge that we're needing to create from the actual Hawthorne crater itself, which was blown, as I say, on the 1st of July in 1916. Next slide. Talking about the actual communities, there are a lot of communities that are there and have been working with us. Erasmus, for example, without Erasmus, we could not have facilitated this. And I think this is incredibly important for all of us who are researchers and wanting to actually start now. It was really interesting what Nicola Tremolo said this morning, to actually just grasp it and go with it and start, and don't wait to be asked. And I think this is exactly the same with this project. If we'd waited to be asked, if we waited for funding to come through, it might never have moved forward the way it was. Erasmus has funded this on 2 or 3 separate occasions, not only for us to actually facilitate it and go there and work with other colleagues, but also to have our students go there too, notably from film, but also from forensic science. You'll also see one of our colleagues there from Stoke-on-Trent City Council Archaeology, who also came with us too. So it is all about very much community driving the actual story itself. Next slide, please. And as you can see from the team photograph that we have actually got there, we've got a number of people that are working with us in Production House and our research there at Hawthorne, including Hawthorne Ridge Crater Association, of which Andy Robertshaw is one of the main leads with the actual organisation there. And one of the characters that's with us all of the time is a farmer who is actually in the middle of this photograph on the back row. And he is in the middle on the right, and he has got a brownish shirt on, and he's called Francis. Without the power of Francis, who helps us actually the archaeologists actually dig out that individual crater, we couldn't actually be working forward and actually finding out the secrets of what is a real time capsule. This has not been opened up before. We do not know what is in there when it was actually blown. German soldiers were on this point at that point in time, as our soldiers came from over the Somme towards the actual crater after it was blown with the mine. But as you can see here, there's a range here. There's chemists from Staffordshire University, and there are colleagues within this image that are from France and Germany, and translators, military historians, and of course our own film student that came out with us as well, who is Eva. Okay, next slide, please. So it is very much about a co-creation process. Our research with Production House is very much working with different stakeholders and different partners and creating new narratives that can be taken on for the next generation, whether that's through new education packages, bringing it back into schools, whether it's actually creating content from museums and heritage. But we truly can't afford to have the kind of content that we're creating, which is either drone footage, 4K, or shooting in 4K, but also archiving, preserving what different people are finding on the site as we go along, and getting that academic knowledge out immediately, not waiting. As soon as we get it, we can use social media and move forward and tell the stories that we're working with the communities with straight away. And I think that's the joy of working with film and different forms of new media, that we can have that mass dissemination of new knowledge from the actual site straight away. And that is a new way we feel of actually moving forward with different history content today. Next slide, please. I do know my colleagues are in the background. I think I have got one here. The other two are really struggling and they can't get on. So I've just been carrying on here, Agatha. So I know the other ones are there, but they can't get their audio or their image up at the moment, which is a bit of a shame. But anyway, Paul, we'll move on to you because I think we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, hopefully everyone can hear me. So yeah, we're looking at really going into communities and filming with them rather than sort of imposing ourselves upon them. There's always a sort of danger when you go out on a filming project or a documentary project that you arrive in a community, you sort of infiltrate it a little bit and you leave. And it's very much a case of, with the way that we work, is we want to try and integrate with the community. So we want to actually talk to the community. We actually want to be there and learn about the environment that they're in. And the community on this particular project crosses over a whole number of things. Is you've got the military community that's there with people who've had family and friends and people that have been sort of involved in the battles of this site. And there's still, a lot of tourism that goes there. So there's these communities. But obviously we've got to remember that this is a sort of small village, town, farming community in rural France. And we are essentially descending upon them and sort of making films about things that have happened around them. And they're trying to get on with their daily lives. They're trying to farm. They're trying to do these things. So it's really about integrating them into the whole process. And a number of the things we find really key to this is helping them think about the idea of how we create the films that we create. And we find that's a fascinating way of integrating the people into it. We talk about the camera equipment that we use. One of the really significant key parts of one of the early visits we paid to Hawthorne Crater is we went out and we were filming with a drone, so that we could get different sort of visual perspectives from our point of view. And the first time I took the drone up, I had 10 members of the local community, including the mayor, all gathered around me, all throwing in ideas of where we could get shots from, of their fascination with seeing their own environment from a different perspective. So that dissemination is sort of fairly immediate. Another thing that we did fairly quickly with these projects that we discovered with other projects that we'd worked on in France was the idea of quite quick turnaround, doing little pop-up exhibitions every so often with the community involved. Most towns in France will have the little town hall where they have all their public events. So we're fitting in with the community's way of working and the way of understanding. And typical with France is the wine and the snacks come out and everyone gathers around. We share the film content, we share the data. that we've done the visualizations. All those materials go in there. So really important aspects. And the final thing I probably want to say about the communities that we work with is assumptions that we make about their access to technology, the access to fast internet. We found out that rural France doesn't have fast internet, and the way that the community wanted this material shared with them was actually on DVD. And what we ended up having to do is we had to buy a DVD burner so that we could transfer all of our 4K footage onto standard definition DVDs, because that's the technology that the communities were using. So we made sure that we adapted our methods into those things. So from a sort of technology point of view, from my kind of outset, really interesting to work in those ways with the community. So
it's really changing our methods as it happens, really, isn't it? We have to actually think on the run sometimes when we're actually there, because things don't always work, and sometimes people want to have our footage. For example, remember we were there and BBC wanted our footage, and we just could not get it over for the news. It just did not have the actual power to it and capabilities to do that, which is incredibly frustrating. But you learn as you go along. Now, is Andy around with us? Can we hear Andy? Probably not from that ping. You know what? It's going to be one of those days for us, isn't it? I can feel it coming. Okay.
Just anyway, a heads up, we have 5.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. We're fine. We've got about one more video or something to show, which is fine because we've got them there in the virtual room. So talking about Erasmus, we cannot move away from the fact of Erasmus and the European community, and it is such a shame how things have been moving. Without Erasmus, as I say, we couldn't have moved forward with the students of our own students, and to actually be there and to work with us and to own the work alongside other people as we're there, to actually be there and create new content as we're going along, not just our students in film, but also the forensic science students that we've actually had working out there with us too. So next slide, please. And as I say, it's not just the work that we're doing outside at the Crater. The main importance for us from a film technology perspective is bringing it back here and looking at future funding bids. So we've been working on different ways to actually create new content and excite the next generation about the First World War. How can we tell the story differently today? And looking at those new ways and new methods using VR and AR and creating new partners through Production House and the method that we do there to bring them into the fold and create new funding bids. This is one funding bid that we did and we were shortlisted for with Creative XR. And it's really trying to think about bringing soldiers back to life and take them into the classroom that they can tell their own personal stories from Hawthorne Crater. And as you can see, there's a tabletop interactive exhibition that we were actually looking into creating as well there with Andy Robertshaw too. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to try Andy for one more try before I actually go on to near to the end with his actual video. Andy, are you there? Can I hear you? I feel like back in the old job in the BBC. Are you there? No, you're not, are you? Okay. So
I can do a very quick talk through the sort of the mailings bit, which was a significant part of the sort of work that we've done looking at the kind of crater sites and investigations that have gone on for a long period of time where people have looked at the crater site and we've worked around these areas. And one of the classic things that we look at, and this is where the community comes together and shares the sort of shared knowledge. So I'll share my knowledge about camera technology and I'll use technology to figure out, you know, the nerdy details like lens angles. We'll get the historical community coming in and analysing archive and trying to match up two time periods, which is a significant part of what we've tried to do. So the view from where Geoffrey Malins was taking his footage of the crater, that famous footage, people classically look at the line of trees and they simply overlay the mine crater onto it. But that doesn't take in all of that community knowledge, all of that sort of almost tribal knowledge about where the craters actually happened. And we think that's a fairly good estimate of where the actual explosion was and where the cameras were on that sort of time period. And again, we actually sat on that spot 100 years to the minute afterwards with a whole sort of community of people around us at that moment in the sort of anniversary period of the Somme battle.
The morning of the 1st of July, Geoffrey Malins arrives here by means of coming back through the tunnel. He comes down the trench system and he goes to look at an area just here called Jacob's Ladder because he's chosen that to film the battle from. He starts cranking his camera, looking over the top And what he's waiting for is somebody just down here to press a plunger, and at that moment, 40,000 pounds of high explosive, about 20 tons, blows up. And that then goes in the air, we're thinking thousands of feet, and then falls back. And then what he does, I don't know whether he's got time to change film, but he turns the camera and he films the men attacking across that field there. So he's able to pick up the explosion, move and look due south, and the attackers jump off from a trench in that field going towards the crater. A lot of people have tried to overlay the film explosion onto the modern terrain, and whenever they do it, they make a big mistake. Their assumption is that that group of trees is the full extent of the crater on the 1st of July. It isn't. There are two craters there. There's one on the 1st of July and one on the 13th of November. And what that means is actually the real first explosion is further to the left and rather smaller, which means if we overlay Malin's film onto the real location, we'll be able to delineate how much of that tree line is actually July 1916 and how much is the 13th of November, which will change our entire view, I think, of what happens on that ridge. People haven't seen that before, and even when I came here in 2005 and we filmed, we really weren't aware, other than vaguely, of the two craters. And we kind of assumed, as everybody's always assumed, that's the crater. Well, it isn't. It's only some of the crater. The other bits, obviously, are later in the same battle. So it's changing our view of it. And what we can do is say this film is incredibly important. People stare at it, you know, open-mouthed on television, you know, it's behind some talking head in a documentary. They don't really know what's going on. And what we're doing is we're revealing it step by step. And right now, the archaeology going on up there is finding out incredible information that we didn't know 2 days ago.
So we're just going to wrap up then finally here about how incredibly important it is to work together to be able to create and generate this new knowledge. And hopefully with what we're trying to do with film and factual film content is to archive that, preserve that for the next generations. And you might be able to see one little image that's in there that always is a lovely one of him. He's called Sam, and he was at the Potteries Museum back here in Stoke-on-Trent. And he came to a talk that we did there, and he's got his uniform on there. And that's what it's about. It's, in summary, it's about working with different communities, different stakeholders, different skill sets, all of us together for one common goal. And it's about, communities understanding that hole in the ground full of trees and what it's really all about, because all of us have some connection to our past. And so did Sam, and so does Sam.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you so much, Paul and Andrew, if you can hear me. It's so amazing because I obviously know about this project, but it's so lovely to hear you talk about it again. And I've typed some comments to what Paul was talking about, this idea of not really exposing ourselves as a filmmaker on communities and just really kind of working with respect and understanding of their local knowledge, which links so well to what Peter was talking about initially. And I think it's just really incredible how it's kind of very different project. And my own work with indigenous communities, how nice all these things link, despite being such a different pieces of work. So really, really amazing.
Technical problems there, and we do have our two colleagues in the wings. We do have Professor John Casella there. We do have Andy Robertshaw there. Thankfully, they were there on video too. So the actual presentation was a little bit different to what we'd actually planned, but hopefully then we get
it was still amazing, and I think John keeps being very section, so he's definitely here and participating. So. Lovely.
Thank you very much.
So we're gonna move on to Dave, and again, it's really, really exciting to hear about your project, Dave, because even though obviously it's slightly different, there's gonna be lots of interesting elements which again interlink in a different way in relation to communities and communication and connections. So I'm just gonna pass it on to you.
All right, thanks, Agatha. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes.
I'll just try and share my PowerPoint.
Yeah, it works. Fantastic.
Looks good. Great. Thanks. Yeah, good to see so many familiar faces. Feels quite a safe environment today, but there's quite a few other people here as well, which is great. Thanks for letting me present today. So yeah, in terms of my presentation, I'm going to give an overview, background of the project, a look at the people involved, a bit about the composition and creative development of the thing. We did a couple of events, which I'll go into, and then a little bit of a summary about the impacts that we feel this had. So the project I'm talking about is called Heat Work, and this it is an audio. I like to say is, although we had a couple of events that happened over a year ago now. The intention is to continue this project. So it is a live audio-visual performance comprising lots of elements, various musicians, audio electronics, music, experimental composition, and also visual projections. The first performance was funded by Arts Council England. They were really receptive to the project. The bid went through straight away, really. There were no issues. They didn't really give us much feedback, actually. They just seemed very supportive of the whole thing. A couple of performances. The first one local at Middleport Pottery, and then we did another one a few months later in Zurich at the University of Arts. And the project itself was created and managed by Mark Estibero, who is a colleague in music and sound, and myself, who did mostly the live visuals.
Dave, I'm so sorry to...
Yeah.
Black screen, is that what we're supposed to be seeing?
Oh no, you should be seeing... Oh, that's interesting.
We did see your PowerPoint a few moments ago, and it kind of went blank.
Yeah, let me just see if I can share it again.
Sure. It definitely worked. So I'm sure it will be... Yes, it's back. It's back.
I wonder if it's just dropped out. Let me know, and it looks like I might need to keep sharing it. Okay. Yeah, so Mark and I work together in music and sound. I'm sure many of you know this. We've been working here a long time now, probably more than most of the people here today. We also organise another event which is taking place in Hopping next month, actually, called Noise Flow, which is experimental sound and moving image. In terms of this project, Mark worked mostly on the musical side, so live music electronics and acoustic instruments, and my background is mostly audiovisuals, although I do consider myself still a musician. We thought it was a project that was great at widening participation in the kind of things that we're involved with. So we're used to doing things in our closed shop of the university, sharing it amongst other academics, but this was a really great opportunity to get our expertise and interests out into the wider community. Initially, the local community, working with musicians, industrial partners, hopefully to foster collaboration, future work with these people. And aside from that, it was an opportunity to celebrate and disseminate the local culture, mostly based around the potteries industry. We also feel it does have potential for an impact case study, which isn't going through in this ref, but hopefully it will go through next time. I think we can still build on the impact side of it. Yeah, so people that aren't aware, Stoke-on-Trent has a long history with the potteries, dating back to the early 18th century. At the height of the industry, half the population of Stoke were employed in some capacity in the industries. That did gradually decline as manufacture was outsourced to places such as China. There has been recent resurgence, small craft workshops, more interest in buying local crafts and potteries and pots, sorry. Small workshops popping up, individuals working, and the Great Pottery Throwdown has been good at publicising this as well. So the people involved, firstly, BCB Festival. They do have an office at Staffordshire Uni. I don't know if people are aware of this. We talked with the director how we could plan and coincide our performance with the BCV Festival, which obviously takes place every other year, the British Ceramics Biennial. It takes place in lots of venues in the local area, Middleport, Spodeworks, and so on. They exhibit pots, ceramics, artworks from the UK. Sorry, Britain, I should say. And yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. Ian was really receptive to this. It's not something they would normally do, but they were very keen in getting us on board, actually. They also put us in touch with Claire at Middleport Potteries. Middleport has been running continuously as an industrial site for 150 years now. It was, I don't know if it was the largest, but one of the largest pottery manufacturing industrial sites. Still going. The large scale side of it has dropped off a little bit, but there are still some large companies there and some smaller craft workshops. Again, another place worth checking out if you want to buy some things for your kitchen and so on. Yeah, it's just a really nice site anyway. You can go there with tours. There's a cafe. They do have regular events, some small scale concerts, but our event coincided with their annual Christmas lights switch on, which is gets a really good crowd in. Staffordshire Film Archive was another thing we work with, particularly Ray Johnson, who manages the archive. He has a vast collection of archive films of the local area. So it's not just the potteries, although he has a massive selection of those. He houses loads of local films, lots of heritage stored there. And he also runs I don't think this is running at the minute, but on the staff's campus at the Film Theatre, Screen Wednesdays, he usually shows an archive film there. He was really supportive, provided the films no issues, really wanted to get the projects off the ground, be involved, and he helped out with the projection equipment as well. So very enthusiastic and helpful. Accelerate Brass Band, at the time were known as TCTC Group Band. This was a contact that Mark made. A local band, been going since 1955, very professional, again, very keen, motivated, wanting to get involved in the project. Jeff, the band manager, just welcomed us with open arms, really. He just wanted to get his music out there and just to try some new forms of composition and performance. And then Matthias, again, another contact of Mark's. He'd met him at conferences where he was demonstrating this saber system. So this is a sensor that you can attach to, in this case, bass clarinet. It's quite a small device, a couple of push buttons, but it also responds to the movements of the clarinet as he's performing. This transmits information via Wi-Fi, wireless, connect to a computer, and then you can use that to modify various audio parameters, and in my case, visual parameters. Just a quick demo of that.
I'm not sure we can hear the sound.
Okay.
I think you're having the same problem I had this morning.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that is. It might be because I'm on the Mac.
It might be, yes. I am on a Mac and I had this problem this morning, so it might be a Mac problem.
Okay. Yeah. Lost the PowerPoint now. Let's just try this again. Just going to go with the screen rather than the PowerPoint, see if that makes a difference.
Let's try.
Not to worry, we'll just have to go without a sound if you can't hear it. That's a shame, but maybe we could put some of the videos on the showcase, Agatha, as well.
Absolutely. Send me the link and we'll just add it on. And
right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, awesome, great. So yeah, in terms of creative development, Mark was very involved, solely involved in the composition for the brass band. And I know this was a new and challenging task for Mark. He has a lot of experience in composition and scoring, but he's not composed for a brass band. So this was a full 30-piece brass band with percussionists. Quite a very involved process to just be aware of what was required for such a large scale composition and the number of instruments involved, instrumentalists. So a very time consuming aspect of the project, which he did very well. Aside from that, he also processed some audio at the performances. So he did some electronics modifications and processing of interview recordings, and also the live audio feed from the clarinet was processed with delay effects and so on. I interviewed two people that have been are still involved actually in the potteries industry. One of them has been working since she was 17. So she did work for a large pottery company when she set out, but she's more recently started working freelance, making her own ceramics, usually small decorative type floral things. Again, if you're a pottery throwdown fan, you might have seen on one of the shows actually when they were making some of the decorative ceramics. I'll just give this a try. Let me know if you can hear this. If not, I'll skip on.
No, I'm afraid it's the same problem.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, so their voices were used as part of the live performance, like say. It was, we thought it was important to get these authentic voices as part of the performance. And they also had an interesting dimension to the audio soundscape as well. They were processed, like say, in real time by Mark, and it forms a really nice atmospheric element to the piece, but it also captures, records, and also disseminates their authentic voices, which we did feel was important, partly for the impact aspect of the project. So Mark works with a platform called Max and more recently Super Collider, real-time, like say, electronic modification. Yeah, from my side, it is, although I always say I'm a musician, I seem to end up doing more visual stuff. Partly because my PhD is audio visuals, really. I've kind of dug a hole for myself in some ways, but I do enjoy the multimedia aspect of creativity. More specifically, I work in a field called visual music, which looks at the interaction and cohesion between sound and image, usually working with very abstract forms. For this project, I did have a lot of archive footage of people working in the industry, and also BCB provided some more recent drone footage, which worked really well with the older stuff. And I work with it to make it more abstract, but also to maintain the kind of original qualities of the imagery. So I will play a little bit of this. You won't be able to hear it, but yeah, this is more about the visual side.
5 minutes notice.
Yeah, thanks, Agatha. I got that. Yeah, so like I say, quite abstract treatments of some of the visual materials. The events, we did 2 events. The first one, Middleport, like I say, November 2019. It was a Christmas light switch on. Middleport is an awesome venue just to visit. They do have some larger spaces which could be used for performances. We were in quite a small space actually, but in some ways it was good because it was one of the main thoroughfares where people would move between the spaces. So we did get a lot of footfall, people engaging with the performance. You can see there, this photograph on the right shows outside. So this was a very busy event. Jeff and the band also were doing small Christmas carol setting performances, with all the guests singing carols. So Jeff just really wanted to constantly play music, I think. We did 2 separate performances on the evening. This, again, sorry, you won't be able to hear it, but I'll just this will give you an idea for the event as it happened. So yeah, you can see the projections in the background there. I'm kind of off to the left. Matthias here right up front, doing his solo. And then this was another shot of the brass band. Yeah, so I edited the videos after the event. We got one of the student companies actually filming it. They call themselves Muddy Video. I don't know if anybody's heard of those, but they were really good. Had a couple of different camera angles. You can't really see Mark or I in this, but I'm kind of hidden behind Jeff, and Mark's down to the right, but we were there. But yeah, like I say, really good atmosphere, large crowds. It was still technically part of BCB, although it was towards the tail end of that. And the mouse again. So yeah, at that point, we thought the project or the performance was finished. We had done the events that we had told the Arts Council we intended to do. It turned out we did have a little bit of money left. So we liaised with Matthias in Zurich, and it just so happened he was running his own smallish festival based around his Sabre system in April 2020. And it just worked out. We had just enough money to go over there and do a cut down performance with just the audio electronics, the live visuals, and Matthias's bass clarinet solo. So again, just a very brief clip. You can see the visuals more clearly here, and Mark again and I are behind the camera, so you don't see us. Oh, actually, you do see Mark. He does a brief presentation at the beginning. Okay, and then this bit shows how the Sabre system interacts with the video. I can find the right bit. Yeah, so as he tilts the clarinet, it crossfades the image. So it's a way of enhancing his performance in any way you could imagine, really. Yeah, so we did feel this was, at the outset, a good project for impact. I circulated a survey after the event. We got a really good response. It was mostly from members of the band, but it did show that there was more we'd kind of given them more interest in the experimental side of composition. They appreciated the combination of all the different musical and audiovisual elements. It raised awareness of the potteries and local venues. They do intend to learn more about local history. Yeah, I guess I've got like 30 seconds.
Absolutely.
All right, cheers. Their intention is to listen to more experimental musical genres, and it also pushed them out of their comfort zone, which they really appreciated. So we did feel, it feels like the project turned out really well in terms of its intentions. In terms of future, yeah, there has been obviously a big hiatus with performances. We do hope there will be an international heat work. It's something that's been on the back burner for quite a while. We're hoping it will happen. The interest is there, we know that. And we hope to work with international universities and also Matthias and possibly Accelerate Brass Band again. Okay, thanks. I'm finished.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Dave. When I was watching how much I miss going to live events and being in places and listening to the music being played live. Hopefully it's going to happen.
Hopefully it won't be long.
Beautiful. So last but not least, we have a duo, Mark and David. So if you don't mind introducing yourselves, and the rest of the panel is yours.
Thank you very much. I think David is going to start off. So maybe David, you could introduce us, and are you going to manage the PowerPoints as well, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think Mark needs much introduction to this community. But yes, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. And I'm just sharing my screen now. Hopefully that's okay for everyone.
Yes, it's we can see everything.
Fantastic, great. So today, Mark and I are going to talk about remote collaboration, creativity, and communication through controlled improvisation in a virtual context. So the esteemed professor, Margaret Barrett, wrote in 2014 that collaborations may occur on a number of levels and degrees of separation, including those of place, time, and expertise. And as we've all seen over the last year, this practice has really proliferated, and we have ourselves experienced collaborations that really do transverse huge temporal and physical distances. Last year alone, I took part in a number of ensembles, small, medium, and large, the largest being the Virtual Guitar Orchestra, which brought together 200 guitarists from 40 countries, which is quite a feat. But there is a slight problem with all of these ensembles, and that's they don't really constitute live music performance. In all of those kind of ensembles, performers would resort to pre-recording their material, sending it to a third party, and then stitching it together. And you lose the liveness when you do this. So along came our idea, and I guess this idea has been cultivated for a few years. Mark and I met when we were at Durham University, myself doing my undergraduate, Mark doing his PhD in 2016, and we became better acquainted through the International Guitar Research Centre, especially a conference they had in Hong Kong in 2019, But really, things kicked off in our collaboration this January. Mark mentioned this conference and the upcoming Noise Floor conference, and he wanted to collaborate on some kind of composition or performance, and straight away I thought this was a great idea, and we could address some of the things that have been lacking over the last year. So what has been lacking from live music performance? Well, there is the comfort and discomfort of presentness, there is performer vulnerability, risk and uncertainty. All of these things we might think that we actually want to get rid of in our performances, but actually they're so integral to what makes live music making so great. So this is very much the background. And then we met in January and we started exploring some of these ideas.
Fantastic. My turn, I think. So, yeah, I'm Marcus DiBero. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an associate professor of music here at Staffordshire University. So let me talk a little bit about the aims of this project that I've been doing with David over the last 3 or 4 months. The aim is simply to compose a piece for 2 guitars with live electronics, and to use that as a way to explore sort of collaboration at a distance, sort of co-performer communication in a virtual environment. Beyond that, the aim of the performance was to use the natural sound of the guitars to control the electronics. And another aim was to create a composition which acknowledged and embraced the latency that David was talking about, which is inherent in all online collaborations. So instead of fighting against it, we would seek to find a way of working which used that latency. So to create an environment that doesn't use that uses the natural sound of the instrument, is to get away from the usual wires, switches, sensors, and touch screens and so on normally associated with mixed music. In fact, we saw in the last presentation from Dave, Matthias, the bass clarinet player, covered in sensors and, you know, little motion capture things and so on. So I really wanted to try and find a way of getting away from that. Why? Is there anything to be gained from such an approach? Well, would be the first to acknowledge that an approach like that has a long and proven track record of allowing musicians to interface with the electronics, and I was definitely not looking to supersede that approach, but to offer an alternative and to explore the benefits and losses of such a way of working and what it might bring. So I guess at this point it would be useful to think a little bit about bespoke digital environments like the one I created, and digital instruments, and to see how they interact with acoustic instruments and what differences they have with acoustic instruments more generally. So possibly the most important difference when we're thinking about traditional acoustic instruments and digital instruments is the relationship that exists between the performer, myself and David in this case, and what would we call the interface, which would be the instrument or the main sounding body. With acoustic instruments, there's a direct mapping between the performer's gesture and the resulting sounds. Indeed, acoustic instruments themselves typically follow a pretty standard model for sound production, and the academic and composer Joel Chadabe has identified 3 components of an acoustic instrument: a controller, a sound generator, and a link connecting the 2. So in a guitar, which is our example here, the controller would be the string, the sound generator would be the main resonating body of the instrument, and the link would be the bridge and the nut, or the frets, on the guitar. And when we add the performer to this description, we can see that there's a direct physical connection between the performer's gesture and also we can see that this model of a music instrument is a deeply embedded cultural archetype amongst our communities, and it continues to persist even into the age of digital instruments. But digital instruments are completely different in that any physical connections between the performance gesture and the resulting sounds are there just because of design decisions, because of something that I've decided to build in, rather than any sort of inherent physical connection. With digital instruments, all the mappings are arbitrary, and there's no necessary physical causal relationship between the gesture and the sound. Indeed, the boundaries that exist between the performer and the interface and the sound engine are very blurred and are far from clear. And in fact, there may be no performer at all in any traditional sense. This could be just about anything. So this arbitrary mapping of performance parameters to the sound engine was one of the motivations for moving the interface back to simply the acoustic instrument, simply using the guitar to control the electronics. But the very nature of acoustic instruments, the ways in which we as a society engage with them, and associations that they carry, also influenced my decision to remove the traditional digital interface from my design. Traditional acoustic instruments, including the guitar, have long and well-established histories of performance practices and techniques, and are continuing to evolve today. As musicians develop these performance skills, they're also internalizing highly specific embodiment relationships. And the necessary skill sets, the awarenesses of the instruments, move from the conscious mind to the unconscious mind. And you get virtuosic performance, which is only possible through the development of a complex hierarchy of embedded sensory motor skills. Musical performance, particularly virtuosic performance, is a very demanding activity which demands the integration of timing, motor sequencing, spatial organization, and so on, necessary to respond to information coming in real time. Yeah, I think can we go back a slide there? Mm-hmm. There, yeah. So the musician needs to be responsive to all of these things in real time, and to be able to use things like pitch, dynamics, timbre, and interface, and so on, was one way to approach this and to try and make it better. Let's go on to the next slide there, David, then. So this is the environment I created. It's a schematic. Very simply, we can see that audio comes in to the environment. It goes to a pitch tracking algorithm, which is looking out for a particular note. As soon as it recognizes that note, then it moves through a series of what sort of pre-composed scenes, which changes the parameters for 2 chains of effects. It's the right there, and it steps through 12 different environments. And the next slide. Yeah, so this is just an example of some of the super colliding coding that I did. I think for anyone not familiar with super collider, the first thing to notice is that it's a text-based language, which can make it challenging to use, but is also one of the strengths of the environment. Next slide there, David. Oh, I think that's back to you, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we were composing the piece, Latent, the score and the patch were very much composed in tandem, even though Mark took the lead with patch, and I had more of a major part with the score. And it became apparent to us that a non-time critical score would be an appropriate way to notate the music, as that would encourage interaction between the guitarist and the electronics, that patch, in real time, without concern for the restraints and restrictions of latency. So Mark began composing the gestural material in accordance with the patch. When you're trying to feed musical material into a patch, it's best not to have the gestures too long. You can imagine a computer struggling with how to process a minute-long fragment of music. Therefore, smaller fragments lend themselves well. And these are just some early sketches which Mark sent to me as kind of a compositional impetus. And that in turn informed the gestures which I created for the piece. In some ways, the melodic and material that we created was very similar to one another. In other ways, they were different. I prefer slightly smaller gestures, for example. And these were some of the motifs which I composed or borrowed from other sources. So really influenced here by the music of the Cuban composer Leo Brouwer, and also the composer Mark Cadena. And then came the problem, how are we going to unify our individual aesthetics within this piece? So we began discussing a number of different graphic scores by composers such as Fernie Howe and the New Complexity movement, and also composers more recent, such as Eric Egan, who use scores which aren't linear in their construction. I am not a visual artist, and so these were the fruits of some very late night sessions trying to come up with a vehicle for how we could put together our material and would also work in context with Patch. And it was during this time that it became increasingly obvious that our collaboration was a manifestation of the balance between order and chaos. Whilst we both had very shared musical interests, especially through the guitar research centres, where we got to know each other, and we have very different areas of expertise. Mark, for example, in my eyes at least, is an expert coder. He's too humble to admit that, but he is. Whereas I am a complete, he's shaking his head, but whereas I am a complete coding novice, he favoured, as we saw earlier, slightly longer musical gestures, but slightly shorter. Technology was aiding our collaboration, but at the same time, neither of us had access to the soundproof rehearsal rooms or the expensive mics, which we might like to have recorded this using. And just to elucidate here, or shine some light on some of the different software and technologies that we use to connect us, myself in Cambridge and Mark in Staffordshire, Zoom, Facebook Messenger, email, Google Drive, Sonovus, good old-fashioned phone. We used all of these things, and in February alone, we spent 1,222 minutes on Zoom trying to bring the patch and the score together. I think it's important to shine some light on this informal nature of the collaboration. And it became obvious also as we were collaborating that as co-performers, co-composers, collaborators, we were mediating marriages of insufficiency by bringing varied profiles of skills, knowledge, and expertise to the enterprise. And through our collaboration, we were starting to embody and assimilate each other's approaches to communicating, to gesturing, each other's approaches in this regard. And because of this order and chaos manifestation, which was permeating our collaboration, the idea of the yin-yang symbol came to mind as a good way of presenting this visual score. And there we have latent the piece. On the right-hand side, the white, which is meant to represent the order, my 10 gestures. On the black left-hand side, which is meant to represent chaos, is Mark's 10 gestures. The fact that his was on the left and mine were on the right was just purely by chance. And the way the piece works is that you take a fragment, you improvise around the fragment, you mediate the expressive parameters of that fragment for about a minute, find your way to that lowy, that ubiquitous kind of sound of the low string of the guitar. And when you play that, the pitch tracking algorithm.
That's 5 minutes, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. The pitch tracking would pick that up and then move to the next progression of the patch. And thus the piece proceeds like that for about 10 minutes.
So these are the performance directions that we wrote to go with the score. One approach, I guess, would be to have a completely structured piece of music where everything is notated, everything is carefully directed, and you just play what's on the score. At the other end of that spectrum would be just free improvisation, where we just play, we listen to what's coming out of the electronics, and we respond. Free improvisation like that tends to be very challenging and rarely satisfactory. So one approach is to just create some limits for your improvisation, which is what we're trying to do with these performance notes. So it's a way of talking about the performance gestures, and it's also a way of defining the limits of the improvisation. And I think we have a quick excerpt to play for you next. Oh no, before we do that, for anyone who's interested, I'm just aware of the time. There is the schematic of how we collaborated remotely. We used Sonobus as a audio networking device, and we used OBS to mix the audio and the video together. And I think we should probably just skip the next slide and move straight on to the, and if we have time, we can come back.
I've just moved that on thinking of time. So there's a short excerpt there from the 10-minute piece. We found that the piece was a great vehicle for really interrogating the processes of communication that were happening between us as co-performers, but also our respective electronic patches. Obviously, we would have a direct influence on each other, what we were doing both visually and sonically, but also we would be indirectly influenced by the sound of the patch. So it really is fertile ground for investigating what actually happens. How would a co-performance communicate in the moment of real-time music performance? So just by way of some closing remarks, maybe Mark, you'd like to go through these?
Sure. Okay, so the musical pluralism of, actually, David, could you talk through these ones?
Okay, yeah, I'll round it off. So the musical pluralism of 21st century guitar practice, broadly conceived, we believe, has really brought guitarists to the vanguard of remote collaboration, partly through how relatively easy it is to jack up, mic up these instruments, let's say, in comparison to something like the clarinet, which is a little bit more difficult and a little more uncommon. We also found that the ongoing collaboration between ourselves and the nature of our artistic practices research both reflect and manifest the notion that our performance approaches and identities cannot be predetermined, but need to emerge anew in each case. That's in each case of each performance and each time we meet to collaborate. As we found that too closely and tightly determined a relationship between the practice and the research is not necessarily conducive to great artistic work. And finally, we found that the innovative nature of Latent, of the piece, which fosters unique relationships between us as co-performers, sonic stimuli, technology, visual stimuli, and the score, which measures 1 meter by 1 meter, so it's a big boy. We found this whole plethora, this whole bespoke environment really did allow the interrogation of our collaborative, communicative, and creative processes as they emerged in real time during performance.
Yeah, and hopefully this is just the beginning of, this is the first one we've done. I think it went very well, and I'm looking forward to building on this in the future. So, lots to explore here. I think we're out of time, aren't we? Because I can see Agatha's popped up.
It's so fascinating. I'm really regretting that we don't have more time, but I think the keynote speech is starting right now. So I'm just gonna say thank you so much, and I'm sure we're gonna continue these conversations in a more informal way here and outside of this event. But yeah, wonderful presentations, and I'm really grateful that all of you agreed to be part of this panel. I think it was just absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much, and for those of you who are gonna watch the keynote, I'll see you right away in the other session. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to kick off if everybody is ready. So this is the afternoon panel number 2, Learning in Context. And with us, we have Martin Smith, who is a lecturer in creative writing at Manchester Metropolitan University and a PhD candidate for the North of England Consortium for Arts and Humanities. His research is primarily interested in new forms of script writing and storytelling for immersive media. I can see them this end.
Yes, good,
Yeah.
fantastic. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. As was mentioned, I teach creative writing. I'm doing a PhD in immersive media and script writing. But the talk that I'm giving today is just a little rumination that started at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Like people in all professions, academics working in the higher education sector had to adjust suddenly to the pandemic in March last year. And one arguably understudied area of academia that was affected was the academic conference, which has been defined by Budd et al. As a traditional platform for researchers and professionals to network and learn about recent developments and trends in a particular academic field. As a result of the current situation, conference organisers found and continue to find, as we can see today, themselves forced to pivot to online conferences with remote attendance and participation. But while the current situation necessitated a sudden sector-wide shift, online conferences were a growing trend even prior to the pandemic. With this talk today, I'm going to investigate the shift to virtual conferences and the potential problems and opportunities that it presents. In order to do this, I'll start by trying to answer the question, what a conference is for, first through a quick reflection on my own experience at conferences, before relating these experiences to recurring answers to these questions from relevant literature. Having explored what purposes conferences can serve, I'll then outline some of the potential advantages and disadvantages of virtual conferences in comparison to traditional face-to-face conferences, before ending by exploring the potential for online technology to give rise to a more drastic reconceptualization of the academic conference than seems to have generally happened so far during the pandemic. So to start with a reflection, during the first year of my PhD, I presented aspects of my research at 3 conferences. They all attracted different types of audiences and speakers, but they all showed a very similar structure that I'm sure will be very familiar to many of you listening to this. Panels of 3 or 4 talks, questions from the audience, either at the end of each talk or at the end of a full panel of talks, more informal periods of activity and conversation, like poster presentations and tech demos, and longer keynote presentations. Of the 3 conferences, only one involved any remote participation from one speaker who had unexpected visa issues and so did their presentation via Skype on a little table put at the front of the room that was quite hard to see and hear. So it felt quite clear that there wasn't really a contingency plan in place going into the day, because remote participation just wasn't standard practice at a lot of conferences leading into the pandemic. So these conferences served as milestones of progress for my project, important experiences as well in terms of my own professional development. They forced me to articulate my research to a variety of audiences, allowed me to build professional relationships that have resulted in lasting collaborations, and challenge my ideas and reasoning through audience questions and informal conversations, which made my thinking and my project more robust. However, these positive experiences came at some expense, both financially and in terms of time. Participation required travel to the venue, overnight accommodation for at least one night, subsistence costs, and 2 of the 3 conferences charged attendance fees. And even with some of these costs reimbursed, each conference carried a financial cost to me personally, and it would not have been possible to get the same partial reimbursement had I just been attending the conference rather than presenting, which would have prevented me from attending. The conferences were also disruptive to my caring responsibilities for my young daughters, requiring time away from home in order to participate, which placed an unfair burden on my wife for the time that I was away. So in this reflection on my experiences of academic conferences, there are echoes of the recurring arguments made in the literature on academic conferences that explore questions such as what are conferences for and why do we conference, which are both important questions to consider here in order to later address the relative advantages and disadvantages of particular types of academic conference. Gaikora et al. Describe the key benefits of conference attendance for the individual academic as learning opportunities, sharing of ideas, and networking. Other literature on the subject also emphasizes both the possibility of learning about the subject and the opportunities for networking and collaboration that can take place at conferences. For example, Broadfoot et al. Use a survey of conference participants asking why do scholars conference to suggest the main reasons academics attend conferences are to keep up with recent research, meet and socialize with colleagues and friends, and improve their academic record. Similarly, Erickson et al. Argue that conferences are important because they bring people together to share, discuss, and develop knowledge. They enable participants to interact with one another, offering the possibility of forming new relationships and strengthening existing ones. One way of conceptualizing these overlapping statements is that academic conferences allow communities of practice to develop, as academics convene in a shared domain of interest to interact and learn together around a shared practice. If it is the case that one of the primary benefits of a conference is to facilitate a community of practice, why did the face-to-face model of conferencing remain prevalent until the current pandemic? What might the advantages be of this model of conference, and to what extent might these aspects also be true of virtual conferences? In describing some of the advantages of face-to-face conferences over their virtual equivalent, Sa et al. Argue that attendance at physical conferences can give rise to a feeling of belonging to a community with common interests, and that many of the interactions between lecturers occur in the corridors, in coffee breaks, or in the social side of events. And others have made very similar points about the importance of the more informal, sometimes chance interactions at physical conferences being crucial to the experience. The often repeated assertion that participants in online conferences feel less connected than those at physical conferences is sometimes accompanied, but not always, by specific examples that would seem at first glance to support that claim. For example, while writing about a conference held in the 3D virtual environment Second Life, Erickson et al. State that one of the major drawbacks of the conference compared to the face-to-face equivalent is that there was a scarcity of opportunities for unstructured social interactions that create and reinforce social ties. However, Kaimura and Ho offer quantitative evidence for consistently strong participation and a feeling of belonging to a community over a 5-year period at a particular teaching conference that they're writing about. And indeed, Sempia in 2011 wrote about the same Second Life conference as Erickson, but from the perspective of issues with the event's design, arguing that the lack of social interaction was caused by problems with the architecture of the virtual environment and the similar appearances of the participants' avatars. From this, I think it's possible to conclude that careful design of online conferences can alleviate a lot of the perceived loss of meaningful social interaction. Of all the questions that I've researched during this little detour in my research over the last year, it has been by far easiest to find writers listing the disadvantages of the traditional face-to-face conference, or as I've seen it described, the legacy conference, which obviously is a loaded phrase implying that it's a model of conferencing that maybe belongs in the past. The most common criticism is the environmental impact caused by travel to physical conferences, specifically the carbon emissions. Conversely, the reduced carbon footprint is an obvious and often mentioned advantage of virtual conferences. Hybrid models mixing virtual elements with regional physical events, such as hub and node models, where conferences are connected by regional face-to-face hubs, can be one way to cut down international travel and reduce a conference's carbon footprint while maintaining some face-to-face interaction. Other disadvantages of physical conferences include accessibility issues, the travel and cost leading to a potential lack of inclusivity and diversity, and the arguably flawed models of learning that are built into the design of many conferences. Viglione has noted of the current situation that many of the adjustments that conferences are making, such as introducing virtual participation, are accommodations for which disability activists have been clamoring for years. This applies both to the navigation of sometimes inaccessible physical spaces and the travel to conferences, which is also a potential barrier to participation for those from particular parts of the world who may have visa issues, or for people with caring responsibilities who can't be away from home for multi-day conferences and time-consuming travel. It is these sorts of restrictive structures and constrictive processes that Broadfoot et al. Argue act as exclusionary mechanisms to reduce diversity in conferencing content, practices, presences, and voices. Broadfoot et al. Also raise the issue of the learning structures evident at many conferences, stating that conference activities involve too much one-way communication, and arguing for rhizomatic conferences with learning happening from any participant to any other. Raven and Ellsberg make a similar point, criticizing the so-called transfer model evident at many conferences, in which learning has taken place when information from the active sender, as encoded in the message, has been absorbed by the passive receiver, and stating that while there has been extensive experimentation practically everywhere else in the educational world, this is not the case for conferences. As I've already mentioned, one of the key advantages of virtual conferences and main factors pushing experimentation with new models before the pandemic is the reduced environmental impact of virtual conferencing. However, this is not the only aspect of virtual conferences that might be preferable. Superficially, it would seem the advantages and disadvantages of virtual conferences are the inverse of those found in face-to-face conferences. But a deeper analysis demonstrates that the situation is probably not quite that straightforward. For example, while an entirely virtual online conference removes some of the barriers to participation of face-to-face conferences, the format potentially erects new barriers to participation, such as digital literacy and the uneven geographical distribution of high-speed internet. There is also some disagreement from those with experience of organising online conferences of some of the potential advantages. And I can't see the chat, but maybe the people involved in organising today's event might have something to say about this next quote. Aka Kulvizet et al. Write of their experience organising a virtual conference, suggesting it was much more straightforward than organising a physical conference, as there is no location to organise, no rooms to book, no projectors, caterers, entertainment, travel, or hotel reservations to worry about. But conversely, others disagree with that. Gaikora et al. Suggest allowing 6 to 9 months before the date of a synchronous online conference for scheduling an organisation, as they found the challenges posed by virtual conferences with participants in different time zones to be uniquely complex and time-consuming. One thing that a lot of the literature on the subject agrees with is that one potential advantage of online conferences is the ability to target higher profile contributors who have to invest less time in the conference, and so the conference might be able to have a wider reach and a bigger impact as a result. In contrast to the recurring argument explored above that face-to-face conferences allow for more meaningful informal interactions between participants, it's also been pointed out in a lot of the literature that some people find the online format less socially intimidating. There are also a number of potential disadvantages of virtual conferences. Technological problems are an issue mentioned in pretty much all of the literature that I've reviewed for this talk. Another common issue that comes up again and again is time zone differences causing logistical problems. And McDonald in 2020 also made the point that a switch to online conferences will financially impact many research networks who may be relying to some extent on conference revenue and may find it hard to convince people to pay full conference fees for a remote experience. All right, so now I come to the problem that I don't really claim to have all the answers to today, but I just kind of like to leave people with to think about. It's not necessarily a disadvantage of virtual conferences as a concept, but it's more sort of an observation of most of the examples of virtual conferences that I've read about in the literature and that I've observed over the year. That observation is that to some extent, at least, people seem to be transferring the existing structures of the traditional face-to-face conference wholesale onto an online platform. Sat et al. Argue that virtual conferences encourage much more unidirectional information than bidirectional communication between the speakers and the audience. That would be a break from the so-called transfer model that people have criticized in face-to-face conferences. But is it actually the case? If an online conference is replicating a synchronous traditional conference structure comprised of panels of talks and brief periods of questioning, why does this automatically result in a very different form of unidirectional communication and learning just by virtue of being online rather than in a physical space? I don't see that it does. So what should we do? How might we be able to grasp this moment where we're forced to change the way we conference and create new ways of doing things that are better than what came before, rather than just a duplication of old practices? And I don't pretend to have all the answers today, but here's a few what-if questions to play with. a few things I would like to try myself if I had more time, or see being tried by others. Firstly, what if we embrace asynchronous conferencing? What is really being gained from these things being live? We could be interacting asynchronously over a longer period of time around shared objects of study or problems, whatever there might be, pre-recorded videos or written pieces or whatever, quite just questions, developing our ideas in collaboration and discussion at our own convenience. Rather than a conference being a synchronous event where a community of practice might emerge, how about an asynchronous conference as a community of practice, working together on shared questions over a longer period?
5 minutes.
Secondly, what if? What if we are sticking, for whatever reason, to synchronous conferences? What if we just binned the video calls? Now I'm speaking here a year into the pandemic, more than a year, deep in the midst of Zoom burnout. And I would posit that live video calls are a uniquely exhausting way to spend your time. Bad for your eyesight, bad for your posture. A lot of my students have shared with me that they find them bad for their mental health, that it triggers their anxiety. And I could go on. I could carry on, but I won't because I don't have infinite time. But just to say that I, for one, can't wait until video calls stop being a part of my daily life. The next trend in social media seems to be audio chat rooms. And I take from that a lot of other people feel similarly. There's a new social network called Clubhouse where an organizer can start an audio chat room, choose who is on stage and who is in the audience, then do a live voice only chat room, kind of like a live podcast where it's easy to interact with the audience and to pull them up on stage. And already, very quickly, Twitter and other sites have pinched the same functionality. I think it's called Spaces on Twitter, but it's basically the same thing as Clubhouse. To me, when I see this trend and I have a bit of a play around with it, that feels like an ideal platform for an audio-only conference. And lastly, my last what-if question. What if we unconference? So the unconference, which is short for the unconventional conference, is a concept that dates back to 1985 and grew out of the technology industry. They are traditionally physical face-to-face conferences, but despite their roots as physical conferences, I think that they may provide a precedent for how participant interaction at online conferences might be managed to encourage a different form of peer learning and collaboration. There's various established formats of sessions on conferences to facilitate discussion and collaboration that I'm not able to get into today, but I think that some of them would lend themselves to existing social platforms. The idea of an unconference is that it aims to prioritize conversation over presentation, with an agenda set by the participants, less lecture-style presentations, and more emphasis on discussion and cooperative knowledge. As such, they may address some of the common concerns about virtual conferences being less adept at allowing meaningful interactions between participants by making the meaningful interaction between participants the primary activity of the conference. Okay, so I will conclude, but here's a bibliography on the screen if you're interested, my Twitter and LinkedIn details if you'd like to add me. But to conclude really quickly, the COVID pandemic has necessitated a sudden shift across the higher education sector, away from the dominant entrenched model of face-to-face conferences. While the current situation has accelerated the shift to virtual conferences, there was a trend before the pandemic and a growing push from many scholars to develop and experiment with new, more sustainable and inclusive models of conferencing. Virtual conferences can address some of the common criticisms of face-to-face conferences, but do also have their own disadvantages and barriers to participation. But it's my central argument today that by closely replicating the structures and activities of traditional face-to-face conferences, many online conferences aren't fully exploiting the potential for a new form of conference, designed with online platforms in mind and built on collaboration and interaction. As online conferences become more necessary and the means of delivery change, there's a very strong case for the structure and style of conferences to also be radically reimagined. All right, thank you for listening. Yeah, I did it in 20 minutes, great. I'm looking forward to hearing the other talks, to any questions that you might have. And if you want to carry on the conversation on Twitter, feel free to add me. Thank you.
We also have Kinga Rogowska. Please tell me if I pronounced that wrong. who's a doctoral candidate at the University of Warsaw, who graduated with a master's degree in 2019 with a dissertation about superhero movies as a genre. Her research is focused on rhetoric, genre studies, and multimodal analysis. She is passionate about teaching and science communication in the field of rhetoric.
So, hello, my name is Kinga Rogowska, and in the next 20 minutes, I would like to show you how, from the rhetorical and the generic point of view, remote teaching and learning has formed in Polish high schools, and the evolution or revolution of two genres that help to keep the student-teacher relationships strong, even in the times of pandemic. I argue that the important features of genres that help in building or maintaining the sense of community in an online classroom are that they are synchronous methods of teaching, in the sense that they are based around a meeting with the students in real time, and they are focused on an interaction between students that engages them, provokes conversations, make them emotionally involved in an activity in a genre they are participating in, and creates some roles they can fit into. We are in a new reality, but we try to imitate the old one with the genres we are choosing. Let's start with some statistics. What you can see on this slide are 9 popular methods of remote teaching used by Polish high school teachers, and which were generally positively rated. The most popular one, as in most teachers had tried it, is writing messages through an online gradebook, which is something they were used to because they used this form of communication before the pandemic, before the switch to remote. However, it turned out it's not as effective in the long run as the other ones when it comes to fully remote education. The yellow bars you can see are the methods teachers graded the highest. Online classes on Microsoft Teams, individual consulting with students, and online classes on other platforms such as Zoom or Skype. What is worth noting, from the 9 methods shown, the ones graded the highest are the ones that are live, that are synchronous, the ones that as closely as possible imitate the situation students and teachers know and what they are used to the most. In a report from the early days of remote education in Poland, it started near the end of March 2020, 79% of schools had at least one teacher who decided to use synchronous methods of remote teaching, understood here as a video meeting with students. And now, after over a year with a short break, more teachers are encouraged to do so by parents, students, school principals, etc. At the beginning, a lot of teachers, of course, felt unprepared. They have never used most of the tools they are now fluent in. So what genre and rhetoric have to do with it? First, I want to present you with the understanding of genre I refer to. The way of understanding genre I focus my research on is based in rhetorical genre studies and the definition of genre that Carolyn Miller proposed. Genre is a typified rhetorical action based on recurrent situations. So if a situation occurs, we've been in that situation before, we know how to react, we know how to respond, what genre to use to respond and react. What is crucial to the field, but also to the subject I'm presenting today, it was rightly pointed out by Amy David, who said genres are never really stabilized. Even temporary stability is an illusion of genre theory rather than a reality of genre in action. So when we're looking at a particular genre or a group of them, we need to realize they are a process, not a finished product. And what we see is a current state of this genre and how it is used, not its full potential. However, analyzing genres in isolation is valid. It will not give us a whole picture of complex communication processes that occur in social environments. Our behavior in given situations in certain social contexts is genre-fueled, and those genres interact with each other and influence each other. And I'm fully aware of that, but today I will only focus on 2 genres of remote learning, their features, how they work, and what it means for their potential when it comes to community building and creating a sense of togetherness in an online environment of students and teachers. Those two genres are a debate, a school debate, and game-based learning. Both of these genres were being used before the switch to the remote education, but I'm focusing on an online version of those genres because they evolved, they adapted to the new situation. As its definition states, a genre is based in recurrent situations. Here, the recurring situation is a lesson. Even though it's a more remote learning, it's still a lesson. The change is difficult not to notice. And with the change in the situation came the change in the chosen genres. I define a school debate as a form of teaching online in synchronous manner, as in a form of a meeting when the teacher is presenting a hypothesis to students, and their task is to discuss the hypothesis, find appropriate arguments, and present them in an organized way according to rules set by the teacher or the rules they discussed and set together. The debate is focused on practicing critical thinking and making arguments followed by proper examples. It doesn't particularly follow the rules of the teacher presents the information, the students listen. We know from other genres like a lecture, for example. The teacher's goal in choosing debate as a genre to discuss a subject is to give materials to students from them to figure out the pros and cons of a certain event or some certain idea. It is a way to learn the whole spectrum of a given subject. Of course, there is the rivalry part that adds emotions to the mix, and the students tend to see winning of the debate as the main goal. To set up a debate, first step is to establish the rules of the debate. The teacher can use one of the known formats and modify it, or create a fully new set of rules tailored to the needs of the subject they're teaching or the time they have to spend to make it happen. If the rules are settled, it's time to divide students into teams. The teams work together, for example, in separate rooms on Zoom or on different calls, and the teacher is supervising the groups, helping them answering their questions and helping them formulate arguments. Finally, the actual debate is beginning. It's happening according to the rules settled at the beginning by the teacher. At the end, the teacher can pick a winner. It's not necessary to pick a winner in a school debate, but it can be done. And then teacher most usually discusses what was said in a debate, how the arguments were chosen, and what did the students learn from the whole experience. The genre of a debate has a long tradition, and this tradition wasn't easily accommodated into the online world. Most formats of debates have a particular set of rules when it comes to space. Speakers have to sit in particular order or sit on opposite sides of the room if they're in different groups. Most of the tools teachers are using in synchronous classes can't replicate that. There are ways to make some adjustments, like changing displayed names of participants to reflect the role they are playing in the debate, or the teacher can ask them to wear a piece of clothing that is in color of their team. However, still, the space relations are very different and in this type of setup in comparison to the offline debate, which for some can be confusing, can put off someone from trying to incorporate this genre into their teaching practices. However, thinking of how to accommodate the online space to the rules of the great offline can be a part of that brings people together. Teachers point out in the study I mentioned before that they didn't make decisions about lessons is the best on their own. They worked this out together with their students, with parents of their students, to make their needs met and to create the friendliest environment for their future work. The debate is always a group activity. Students work together in smaller or bigger groups in order to prepare arguments and examples they will need for the final debate. Even if the final product is a set of individual speeches, students work towards a common goal, which on one hand is to learn about a new subject, but on the other is to win. A student, as a rhetor, wants to present it in the best way possible and convince the audience of fellow students that their arguments are the best ones. The speech has to be adequate to the circumstances. The speaker has to form their ethos of an expert that is capable of being a part of the winning team, having best prepared arguments and a great speech in general. As game-based learning, I understand using online tools like Kahoot, Quizlet, or Jamboard in order to present information to students using gamification techniques. In game-based learning, as in debate, rivalry is a big part of the genre, as a good chunk of those activities have an element of do it first or get the most points, and so on. But students still gain new knowledge doing so. The teacher, whose primary goal is still presenting information, creates a place for students to participate in. They have to do some kind of task in real time, and the teacher can see the whole process of them doing so and summarize their progress in the end. It depends on an activity. Some of them are individual in doing tasks. In some of them, students are divided in groups that can play some game against each other or work together to a common goal. The second ones are the ones that have the same function as working in groups in preparation for the debate when it comes to building bonds among students. In game-based education, the rivalry steers students in different direction. They don't try to present themselves as an expert in a matter, like in debate. They try to be the clever one, the one that figures out the way to victory. Students form strategies, choose roles for themselves based on the information they learn about each other to make use of the full potential of every person in a team. To choose which genre to use in a particular lesson, teachers have to take many things into consideration. One of them being the kairotic perspective of time, which is the best time for certain activity. Which of those genres is better for now, for the current time of day, for the subject they are presenting, for the particular group of students they're teaching, the results they want to see at the end, and yeah, that's it. They also need to take into consideration, especially in the game-based learning, the time it will take to show students a new tool, a new technique, and new rules. They should also be aware of the space students have, both online and in the physical world, that they can't do everything the teacher may want to do with them. Both of these genres have a great potential of community building in an online classroom because they are focused on an interaction between students and teachers. The more interactive the genre is, the bigger the potential. Even though the genres differ in many ways, especially the goals of participants and the character or ethos they are projecting, they both have the capability of reflecting the sense of togetherness a lot of the world of online education is missing. Genres used in remote education impact their participants differently than their offline counterparts because of the space and the situation they are, and still, after a year, the peculiarity of it. As you can see, teachers rate remote learning quite well, and a big amount of them declare that they will use some of the tools and the genres they learned in the passing year when they come back to schools. They also noticed that the relationship between them and students didn't deteriorate, but it is different as the means of contact are. The most important thing is to make sure everyone is feeling like they are still part of a community that the school definitely is and should be. The best we can do is try. Thank you so much.
And then last but not least, we have Gareth, who's been the editor-in-chief of the Exchange's interdisciplinary early career research-focused journal for 3 years. A scholar with degrees in sciences, social science and humanities, his professional interests centre on the cultural aspects of academic publishing and communicative practices, alongside exposing dichotomies operating within the domains labour and power relationship with his presentation, The Transformative Evolution of an Early Career Researcher Editorial Community. Take it away, Gareth.
Well, thanks very much for having me here this afternoon. And in this paper, I'm going to briefly explore the configuration of what's a long-running, institutionally based, open access, interdisciplinary journal based at the University of Warwick. I'll talk a bit about our genesis and our history of our editorial community, as well as our developmental mission, illuminated by conversations with my associate editors. Now, Exchanges was first published by Warwick back in 2013 and originally subtitled the Warwick Research Journal. And it was launched as a collaborative effort by participants from our Institute of Advanced Studies Early Career Fellows Programme. It's a programme which typically recruits among local PhD students and seeks to enhance their professional development within an environment of interdisciplinarity, innovation, internationalisation and collegiality. The first editorial board was comprised of just 7 people drawn from this programme, with one of them taking on the role of senior editor to coordinate activities. By the time we got to 2015, the 4th issue, there was a slight revision to the current cover format, and we had the introduction of the rainbow of interdisciplinarity concept. Although, by this point, there's only one member of the original board remained. Following a brief interregnum, a second senior editor, drawn once more from the early career community, joined it and briefly led for one issue. They were soon succeeded by the third senior editor, who joined in 2016 and took the lead from issue 3-2 onwards. This led to a period of relative stability for the journal. But nevertheless, as can often be the case with institutionally produced journals, once this initial enthusiasm in the community and the founding members had departed, Exchanges could be perceived as beginning to stagnate. Certainly during 2016-2017, the impetus for the title had begun to atrophy, with limited interest evidenced from the IS's then director and a resultant diminishing local institutional visibility too. Subsequently, in 2017, there were steps taken to revitalise activities and efforts to expand the title's vision beyond institutional centricity, spurred by 2 key events. Firstly, a new director of the IAS arrived, possessing a real interest in re-exploring what the journal did and how it related to the Institute's ambitions. Secondly, the first non-Warwick member of the editorial board joined from Monash University, Australia. With perhaps the fortuitous departure in early 2018 of the prior senior editor, the time was right to recruit someone to this role from outside the IAS's programme for the very first time. And they were quite fortunate in that they recruited a researcher who had an active interest in academic publication and labour and practice, myself. Now, for Exchanges, this has kind of spurred a trend towards a greater operationalisation and professionalisation and increased internationalisation of the title's operations and outlook. It also saw a change to the subtitle to the Interdisciplinary Research Journal, re-emphasising this reduced local framing. This sort of period of rebirth perhaps has not been painless, but nevertheless, efforts to recruit more external editorial board members has increased, and we now have universities represented from Shanghai, Brussels and Paris. 2019, though, saw a second revised look for the journal appearing, but perhaps the most significant event in recent years happened in early 2020, when we published the first of our special issues. And this has represented perhaps the next phase in the title's operations, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Exchanges then continues to be published twice a year as a scholar-led, peer-reviewed open access title, publishing interdisciplinary academic research primarily by and for early career researchers. Now, our remit has always been to incorporate work largely but not exclusively from these early career academics in any discipline targeted towards an envisaged broad global academic audience, something which resonates with our host institution. We accept and publish peer-reviewed manuscripts, but with an expectation they incorporate some aspect of interdisciplinary work or thinking. We also include editorial reviewed, interviewed and critical reflection pieces too, which also get very healthy levels of readership. Typically, we will publish any work which passes our quality threshold, and we decline, though, to engage in impact games by only seeking to publish top-drawer articles, simply to enhance our own esteemed credentials. Now, certainly, a lot of our early content originated from Warwick. as we've matured, increasingly we've recognised how essential it is for our title to have a diverse audience, a diverse contributors audience as well for the title's longevity. And we're increasingly decoupling from our institutional centricity, certainly exemplified by the broadening of our editorial board. We operate, like a lot of institutional titles, as a diamond open access model, meaning we are free at point of publication with no author fees. Moreover, because we publish work under a Creative Commons attribution license with authors retaining economic rights, we certainly comply with most funder mandates too. Today, we principally address three missions, again, which synergize with the IAS's mission too. Our primary goal has always been to produce this quality assured forum for early career scholars to contribute to ongoing interdisciplinary discourse. However, a vital but perhaps less recognised secondary goal is a desire to create an enabling environment through which contributors to the journal can be supported in developing their authorial, reviewing and editorial skills. This ambition is realised through participation in the title, along with an editorial policy of being as supportive as possible for contributors and helping to foster effective working relationships alongside positive authorial outcomes. Our third mission, though, is to help enable our contributors developing professional career visibility through publicising their contributions to our networks and social media channels. And this was probably historically the least realised aspect that we did. But over the last year, we've launched our companion podcast series, The Exchanges Discourse, to partially address that mission. Turning now to our editorial board community, which itself comprises a range of late-stage postgraduate and established early career researchers in various disciplines from 7 different institutions around the world. Board members are recruited from both Warwick and our global research partners, usually through targeted calls or occasionally institutional recommendations. While maintaining a broad disciplinary and geographic diversity remains an ongoing focus, the current board membership arises partly as a consequence of these strategic institutional partnerships. However, practically, being able to utilise pre-existing communication channels to recruit quality board members has been very advantageous to us. Board members serve, ideally, for a minimum of 18 months, although they're able to stand down sooner if necessary. Certainly, some have moved on from their original institutions or even been members for longer than the norm, but there are no automatic requirements on them to stand down. This has been to the benefit of the board's range of experience, insights, and collegiality as a community. And today, the board has grown from the initial Warwick 6 or 7 to 15 members. Operationally, board members contribute through advising on policy, managing peer review and copy editing, maintaining contributory relationships and conducting promotional activities. I, as the editor-in-chief, obviously oversee all journal operations, coordinating board member communications, alongside managing their own recruitment, training, support and encouraging their interaction. All of our editorial members have always been volunteers, drawn in primarily by the chance to experience working on an academic journal, in keeping with our developmental mission. Akin to the majority of academic journal titles, they are unsalaried, with the exception of myself, but we do have a small research stipend available to editors based at Warwick, although local regulations preclude us offering these to editors based elsewhere. I would say, as a community, today's board perhaps has still some way to go in terms of cohesiveness. The early boards certainly benefited from geographic coterminosity. However, the pandemic period has seen increased willingness from the board to engage as a collective entity, which has been a rather unexpected bonus. Hence, efforts in this area are to continue enhancing this collegiality and interaction are being pushed more and more as an ongoing focus. We've also acquired what I also call associate editors in recent years, and I'm going to talk more about those in a few moments. A recent development from the journal was producing special issues above the normally published volumes. And this has actually created an additional labour demand, which led us to creating the idea of getting on board some additional people from the postgraduate community. I was originally approached in January 2019 to consider developing the first of a couple of special issues over and above what we normally produce. And each of those issues and then or subsequent issues were produced as a result of an approach from academics from other institutions and Warwick itself approaching us and looking to partner with the journal. When we were first approached, it was unclear how much additional editorial labour might be involved. And from my experience, it was clear it was not going to be a zero-sum requirement. Consequently, I was concerned our extant infrastructure would not be able to produce these additional issues without some more resource. There had been some earlier attempts to produce special issues before 2009, although for various reasons they hasn't coalesced, so they very much weren't something we thought about before this point. What was clear though, producing these issues strongly resonated with the journal's mission and ambitions. And while they diverged from a more varied interdisciplinary content, as they could potentially increase awareness and exchanges amongst new contributor audiences, this satisfied a key demand for the journal. Crucially, they allowed us to test and refine a new publishing mode that is producing occasional issues above the regular ones. They also allowed us to say to our institution that the journal was gaining in recognition, and certainly that's important in continuing our viability as a title. How we enabled each of these issues, how we attracted authors, how we got people involved in them has varied in terms of schedule, connection to external events and recruiting people to work on them. This has allowed us to test a number of different models, but that's probably a conversation for another paper another time. So our issue was we needed to recruit this additional editorial labour, but it was agreed that expanding the board was not desirable. Thus, to support the editorial work for our special issues, we instead recruited from amongst Warwick and Monash University's postgraduate researcher communities. In doing so, we created a new category of editorial contributor, our associate editors, who were intended to oversee the reviewing and the copy editing stages for submitted manuscripts, but wouldn't be expected to advise on policy or be expected to promote the title. In this way, we would limit the labour burden we were placing on them, but also maximising their experience they would gain. Recruitment was largely conducted through personal recommendation within the relevant postgraduate research communities, with the people who had instigated each of the special issues helping us to identify a pool of likely candidates. Each associate editor had some hands-on training and support before they were set to work as part of our editorial community. We've taken on 10 associate editors over the last couple of years, and we're currently looking towards taking on about the same number over the next couple of years as well. Again, we were only able to offer research stipends to those based at Warwick, and this does represent a little bit of inequity, I think. However, it did mean in attracting people to work for us, we had to make an offer entirely based on the experience they would gain working on the title. We hoped they would gain various areas of interest. They would gain an understanding of the publication process. They would have a deeper appreciation of the production side of scholarly publication. They would have an idea of the pragmatics and practice and ethics and relationship management. And we'd also hope they would become more versed in working with a wider range of scholars than just within their own disciplines. To establish, though, if this lived experience came anything close to what my associate editors actually had, I conducted a number of semi-structured interviews with them, talking about their roles and how they'd experienced them. It was very clear from these interviews that 3 areas of experience emerged: those related to publishing, those we could classify perhaps as more personal skills, and those relating to their professional or their career enhancement. Firstly, associate editors recognised they'd acquired a deeper appreciation for the platforms and workflows involved in academic publishing, particularly within peer review processes. Many of their comments related to their experience as authors receiving reviews, but now they better appreciated the nuances of dealing with the differences of reviewer opinion, as well as negotiating revision requirements with authors. Moreover, they had gained significant skills in maintaining working relationships with authors over a protracted period. They'd also gained an appreciation about how the other challenges that authors faced, identifying and communicating concerns within other scholars' works, and as a result, the editorial scrutiny of their own writing outputs had improved. Personally, though, through reading manuscripts, works, and reviews outside of their own area, associate editors had become more confident in understanding their own richness of disciplinary knowledge, as well as gaining a greater comprehension of broader topics. Moreover, through editorially guiding manuscripts with divergent tones, structures, and voices, associate editors have gained a deepened appreciation for disparate but effective approaches to communication clarity, knowledge transfer, and idea expression. And through engaging with multiple authors and reviewers, their communication abilities had improved too, especially in terms of, understanding approaches to achieving effective and constructive professional dialogues. Finally, and perhaps less tangibly, they recognised their professional visibility had benefited from interacting with so many different collaborators over an extended period of time across disciplinary boundaries. They'd also gained a greater appreciation through their editorial labour and discussion with the contributors on how to achieve effective work-life balance between their studies, research, and editorial duties, as well as a deepened appreciation for the competing demands faced by fellow academics, gaining as a result a perceptible increased tolerance and even empathy over delays in contributor engagement. As a title then, we do face, and a community, we do face operational challenges, although thankfully financial is not one of them. We are a relatively low impact title, which means we can struggle to gain sufficient numbers of high quality ingest. And because we get a lot of first time authors approaching us, there's a lot more editorial labour involved in bringing those articles up to publication standard. Moreover, we face challenges to getting into the commercially dominated indexes, and this is an unresolved concern for myself, particularly given the value academic authors ascribe to metrics. Maintaining, though, our editorial community cohesiveness is a challenging aspect due to geographic isolation, but also crucially the career trajectory of individual editors. Because we are commonly calling on people at crucial periods in their research active careers, it's not uncommon for editors to depart after relatively short periods of office, resulting in a loss of experience, recruitment demands, and not to mention a diminishing of the editorial coherence. The inequality between tangible rewards for editors too is also an ongoing concern. As I've mentioned, the COVID lockdown period has actually let us take some more positive steps in overcoming elements of this geographic dissociation because we have been coming together far more regularly. And it's become apparent from the discussions as a result of these, as well as the interviews, that the elements that our editors face that are most challenging is actually structuring their work and doing it in a structured way alongside their other activities. Occasionally, our reviewing pool is also occasionally sometimes too small to deal with every topic, and so we frequently need to seek new scholars to assist us. Again, the common career impermanency of some of our reviewers, because we're calling as part of a developmental agenda on early career scholars, can mean we are frustrated and have to seek additional reviewers at times. And finally, our journal platform is maintained by someone else. It's maintained by the library, which means we are competing for their time in terms of dealing with it, as well as having some uncertainty in terms of how the platform is evolving. In this talk, I hope I've illustrated some of the key elements in our continuing work as an interdisciplinary journal with a developmental mission for its contributors. The new surge of activity around special issues represents arguably a third stage in Exchange's lifestyle. It's served to revalorize the journal, but has created a framework to guide future such interactions. Alongside this, it has served to enrich the experiences of our contributing editorial community, as well as demonstrating to our institution and publisher how we're delivering on their strategic goals and operational aspirations for us. Being a member of the Exchange's editorial community is a commitment to engage with a learning journey. And in this respect, the addition of the associate editors has benefited the whole of our teams by bringing in fresh perspectives. Every editor makes a significant practical contribution in enriching our small community of practice. They gain authentic, if intangible, benefits. But in turn, working with this diverse group of scholars on the regular and special issues is helping to reshape the journal's operations, while also opening up interesting questions on where next for the title. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gareth. So that concludes the presentations for the Learning in Context panel, and I'll move us now straight into our Q&A. So beginning with a question from Andrew Lee for Martin. There we go. Just double checking that you're there. The question is, in what ways can we make conferences or perhaps academia in general more accessible?
Well, I think first you'd have to ask more accessible to who. I think it'd be, well, I think it'd be kind of difficult to find a magic bullet that makes everything more accessible, because I feel like anything that you do might throw up new barriers to participation for other groups. So, for example, where I'm talking in my talk about my curiosity about an audio-only conference, I'm very aware that that would throw up barriers to inclusion for people who are hard of hearing that would need to be worked through in planning that conference. I guess the closest thing to a magic bullet is asynchronous delivery. I can't imagine a scenario where doing things asynchronously would make anything less accessible, unless I'm missing something. So I think that's the thing. I don't know that there will be a rush to do it because of the structures of higher education, but I think that if things were made more asynchronous, people could do them in their own time. That would be one big way to make things more accessible.
Yeah, fantastic. Which leads me on to the next question, really, which is, as we move towards in-person conferences looking more and more likely in the relative future, do you believe this idea of this blended approach, as you've talked about, becoming some of the new norm? And if so, what are the big advantages or the disadvantages in your eyes?
One big advantage is the carbon footprint being reduced. It also makes the conferences more accessible to people who can't travel for multi-days, potentially makes them less expensive for people who have financial barriers. Will it become the new norm, or should it become the new norm? I think it should become the new norm. I'm not sure if it will or not. I think that there's probably too much tied into a lot of universities place a lot of emphasis on place-based learning to distinguish themselves from other places and to compete for students and for research money. So I don't know if it will. I think it's possible. I think that the last year has proven what can be done, like a trial by fire, really, with online technology. So maybe now that people can see what is possible, there will be more eagerness to incorporate a blended approach. But yeah, I do think there's a lot tied into the prestige of the buildings, and that often aren't very functional, but have had a lot of money spent on them, that might stand in the way possibly of people rushing to embrace this model that is better. It is better to do a blended approach because more people can be involved. So yeah, I don't know. I think it should is my answer, but I don't know if it will.
I think it's definitely something that we found as well, which is why I found your presentation so interesting, that this idea of how many people internationally could be involved in today, and having you all here to present and for viewership as well, and getting it out to more audiences, and that idea of accessibility. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
The next question we've got is for Kinga, that asks, through your studies of interactivity and digital mediation in classrooms, did you find that the methods of debate and gamification became dominated by a few students?
So the short answer is yes. Both of those genres tend to divide students into more or less active. And one of the teacher's tasks is to make sure every student is involved in some kind of way, to find a role for every student. And what is interesting is that we observe that the most active students in online classes aren't those same students that were the most active in school in the offline classes. That the change of space caused other students to shine. Maybe they feel more comfortable to share their thoughts and ideas in the online world. So yes, it can be difficult, but it's one of those teachers. Sorry for the steps. My dog is back from his walk. So yes, it is difficult, but it is possible to engage every single student into these activities.
Thank you very much. Which takes on to the next question, which is for Gareth. How well have you found that the associated events for special issues have worked, and what do they bring or add to the journal arc or creation? Oh, you're muted. There we go.
Sorry, yeah. No, that's a really interesting question. I think it's strange because with the Genesis, the original special issues, the very first one was based on an event that had taken place 3 or 4 months before anyone approached me in the first place. So we had just a very little say in how that resonated with the journal itself. And we were very fortunate the next event one was very much tied to an event that we could then turn up at and have conversations around it. I find they are very interesting because they kind of generate for us content from people who might not otherwise consider publishing with the journal. You know, we are a small and disciplinary journal who might even actually consider their work is of interest to an interdisciplinary audience. And one of the things my experience has shown with stuff we've published over the years, everything anyone's doing is interesting to more people than you think it is. But we are there to try and help kind of facilitate that as there. So in terms of sort of journey for the journal, I mean, there are days I get up and I say, I would like us to be a journal that just did special issues, because I find the excitement that is there. I kind of talked about that arc as the journal at the start. We have that initial excitement that kind of dies, and then you always have a sort of 2 or 3 rebirths. Each of the special issues to me feels like a rebirth. It's like an exciting nexus of something happening with the community. It's a new community we're working with. It's new instigators. It's a new group of authors. And so that excitement is palpable. We reach the issue, and then we don't have that long tail off because we're off to do something else with another special issue, with another launch. And so I think it keeps that excitement, keeps that freshness there.
You find that for yourselves as well as for the audiences, it keeps it fresh, and that you have that continual cycle of being really excited about what it is you're publishing.
Absolutely, because when I get approached, I don't know what people are going to approach me about special issues. We do not go out there and say to people, "Oh yeah, come pitch us a special issue." Every single of these 5 special issues we're working on or still working on has been the result of an interaction, another random interaction we've had with people along the line. Some of them have come from reviewers, some of them have come from people who, I don't know, I have asked them, why have you come to us? Some of them said I'm quite enthusiastic when they talk to me about it, but I just like it because they're just different topics. I would love us to have one in the sciences. I have to say, we've had social science, we've got a humanities one, we've got an arts one. We're missing one of the sciences. That if I was going to pitch it anywhere, and as a former scientist myself, I'd get really excited at that point, but I can dream.
Fabulous. Well, you never know. You've put it out into the universe.
I know.
I've
pitched it now, haven't I? Yes.
Fabulous. And I'm just checking if we've got any more questions there. That was the final question. So that concludes this panel. Thank you all for your time and your presentations. It's been truly interesting and super unique, and different presentations for us to watch through, and lots for us to take away, and maybe new things to get pitched at you, Gareth. Who knows? Fabulous. Thank you all very much. So after this, we've got the last but not least keynote speaker, which begins at 5. Join it as you've joined all the sessions. You can also use this time to go and use the coffee space facilities. You can also use the networking to meet someone random if you haven't tested that out yet. It's very fun. It's a little like speed dating, and you never know who you're going to get, and start up some conversations with people there. Try and get as many online connections as we can, and then we will see you all there, and then for the closing after that final keynote. So thank you very much, and thank you for the audience, and thank you for the questions as well.